man who takes two of my classes in the same semester. Glutton for
Hello. Yes.
glutton for punishment.
Well, I had a friend recommend you, and I enjoyed the content, so figured I'd
Okay.
sign up.
What have you read so far?
I've I've read. I just got this in two
Okay.
days ago,
All
so
right.
I've read the reading out of this book. Um, I haven't gone through all the PDFs that are posted, but I read the ones that I think you stated in the email last week to read.
Okay.
Um,
The Meinig essay.
yes, I read
Okay.
that.
It's actually a speech. He gave this speech at um, the American Council for Learned Societies. It's something called the Haskin Lecture, and it's a real big deal to get invited to that. But it's a cool story that he tells.
Yeah. It's funny how that was, I think, given over a century ago, and it's still kind of relevant.
Yeah. He was an old dude. Oh, you're talking about maybe we're looking at something else here. Let me see. Um, you're talking about Ralph Brown, Early Geography Fact and Fancy.
Okay, yeah,
That's
I'm
the
I'm sorry, I'm getting the
no,
two readings
that's
mixed
pretty
up.
old. It was written in that book was published in 1948, and that's a good book still. And in fact, I've got a copy of it somewhere here. Here it is. Um, it's this was the first one of the first textbooks that was used for courses in historical geography. And in your course, we're starting at about we're stopping at 1800 thereabouts.
Hmm.
Mostly, um, that's convenient, right? 1800, and then I pick up 1800 for the second course, and we go to about 1900. So we're covering like 100 years in the second course. In this first course, um, we're looking at mostly 1500, but I'm also going to talk a lot about American Indians, Native American patterns of cultures and that sort of thing early on.
Hmm.
So this class or this particular book, you're going to in that particular book, you're going to cover. I think I counted about what. Let's see. We're going to cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mostly about 10, really about 9 chapters out of the 16. But I'm going to throw in parts of a few others like Texas, and I'm going to add to it because he doesn't treat Louisiana very, very in depth the way he ought to.
Hmm.
So the first part of the course, up until the first midterm exam, we're going to be talking a lot about American Indian patterns. We're going to talk a lot about the Spanish borderlands. In fact, a lot about that. And then New France and the French colonization. And that's really not going to get us very deep into the 16th, 17th century. So the first third of the class is almost before uh, the year 1700. It's really about up until about 1650. Okay. And we're not even going to consider the English until the second term, I don't think. And then the second part of the course, of the second of the 3 parts, we'll look at New England, and that's one of the chapters in Nostrand's book. We'll look at what he calls the middle colonies. I like to divide that up into the Hudson Valley, which is the Dutch, New Netherland, and we'll look at New Netherland and its kind of offshoots, New Sweden, um, and the Finns that come to New Sweden, and basically the area around uh, Delaware and the Delaware Valley, New Jersey, parts of Pennsylvania. And then we'll talk about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is pretty unique. It's very, very different than New England or New York, in that it becomes the first real um, sort of mixing pot for along the Atlantic seaboard. lots and lots of different groups come in there very early. And we're going to eventually get to the southern colonies. And I divide the southern colonies up into, I mean, Nostrand kind of does a broad sweep and calls it the southern colonies, but I will be focusing on cultural sort of core areas, cultural hearths. And that would include the Virginia Tidewater, okay, around Chesapeake Bay. And you'll see from maps that it's amazing how little of the area was actually colonized over the course of a century around the Virginia Tidewater area. So that's a really distinctive area. And then another area is the area around Charleston, South Carolina, the area between Charleston and then to the south, Savannah, Georgia. That's an area referred to as the Low Country, and still is today. And it was colonized by people mainly from the Caribbean, mainly planter families who had gone to the Caribbean for the sugar colonies, and then eventually colonized South Carolina. They were geographically remote from the Virginia Tidewater, although they were engaged in similar sorts of activities, eventually slave holding. They're really different. And there are even other sort of offshoots. The area around the Albemarle Sound and along the Virginia, North Carolina boundary at the coast is another sort of outpost of early settlement. And then in addition to Virginia and Carolina, we'll look at Spanish Florida. Okay, we'll actually covered Spanish Florida earlier. And then we'll look at Louisiana. And Louisiana, it goes through really bizarre stages, beginning with the Spanish. Okay, the Spanish actually put a really important imprint into New Orleans, and then of course the French come in and generally take over. But South Louisiana is a really complex area. We're going to talk about the French, but when I say the French, there are a lot of different French groups. For example, let's see, I had some notes here I was going to tell you a little bit about. Well, who do the French include? You think of any sort of subgroups of the French? There was no France at the time of the colonization.
Yeah.
And so we refer to the French, but there were no single nation of people. So we'll run into at least I'll talk about at least 5 different French groups. Those will include the earliest people into Acadia, the Acadians, who eventually would become the Cajuns after they would migrate down to Louisiana. The habitants of the St. Lawrence River Valley, those were the people who colonized very slowly into Canada and would create Quebec. We'll talk a lot about the fur trade with them. And another group of very important French group were the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, the Protestants, who were the objects of the French counter-revolution. You know, they were the scapegoats of the French counter-revolution. So they got sent off to other parts of the world. They wound up being refugees early on in the Netherlands and England. And because they were Protestants, they were natural allies with the English in their challenge to the French and the Spanish. So the Huguenots are a really interesting group, and they land in places like South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. Another French group were associated with the Habitat, the people in Quebec, or the mixed French and Indian population that you see develop in the Great Lakes area, the Métis. So we'll talk about them. And then we'll also talk about the Creoles that come out of Haiti and the French sugar islands that colonized New Orleans, as opposed to the Acadians. So I'm going to be talking a lot about culture and ethnicity, and that's why I have that ethnicity book for you to, we're going to look a little bit into that, into John Cross's textbook, which is available through the library. I don't know if you've been able to find that, but I'm posting just sections, chapters of that book. So that's one of your first readings also. You'll get a chance to read that. He's a historical geographer, but his book is on ethnic landscapes. And so we'll talk about how ethnicity is associated with developing the landscapes and sort of thing. So lots of culture in this course, and it may seem like we're going really slow, but we're covering things early. And I think that's actually the draw for this course. It's become fairly popular in recent years because of the I think mainly because we cover the development of these cultural core areas that would later influence, the United States as things expanded westward. We're also going to talk about Spanish and colonizing Texas and New Mexico, the upper Rio Grande Valley, the area around Sonora and southern Arizona and California. So, there's that old Frederick Jackson Turner idea of a westward movement, and so we'll be looking also at colonization from the west through the Spanish and other groups. Can you think of any other groups that are relevant to the colonization of the western part of North America?
Besides the Spanish?
Besides the Spanish?
Well, a long time ago, across the Bering Sea Strait.
Oh yeah, well, the Siberians invaded first, right? You're exactly right.
Maybe the French. They were they in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest?
Well, the English did. The English colonized, the Pacific Northwest. There's one other group that often gets neglected, and even by historical geography textbooks, and that is the Russians. The Russians were colonizing. They colonized Alaska, and they were establishing forts all the way down as far south as Fort Ross in Northern California, north of San Francisco. So we'll look at that. And that's one of those many areas that Nostrand kind of ignores a little bit. So I'll be throwing these things in for you. And I'll throw some readings in that are more sort of regional specific to us, like stuff by Terry Jordan on Texas and cattle ranching and that sort of thing. Anyway, I'm just kind of covering a little bit of what the introduction to the textbook. The textbook is good and it's important, but it's only part of what we'll be looking at, and it kind of gives us some structure and some organizational structure. If you've read the overview in Nostrand, then we covered. You'll notice in his chapters he usually has 4 sections. Okay, so it's a really easy textbook to read, and the thing I like about it is it has really easy maps to understand. The maps are not complex; they give you what you need. They're not the prettiest things in the world, but they do give you the basics. So and they're not necessarily all perfect. I've got some. I know Dick Nostrand real well. He's a good friend, but he approaches some culture regions a little differently than I would, which is fine. But so let's see here. In his overview, you might notice that. Well, have you had any geography courses up to this point?
I took physical geography my freshman year, and I'm still on a senior now. But
excellent. Yeah. Okay, physical geography is a great background for this. So you'll know about climate, you know about physiography, physiographic regions, soils, hydrology. All of those are. Nostrand just sort of brushes over a lot of these things, but they are very important in understanding the development of regions and the development of these culture regions. For example, one of the early trades in the South involved the trade in deerskins between the interior tribes like the Cherokees and the Creek groups and the English along the coast in South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. And the English were interested in getting these deer skins. And of course, the Indians were interested in getting English trade goods, things like brass pots, metal, implements, and of course, firearms and gunpowder and lead and shot, and horses. So there were these complementary trades that developed. But the reason I bring that up is that trade system oriented out of Savannah and actually Augusta, Georgia later, was really dependent on the drainage system of the Southeast and the watershed east of basically the Tennessee River, the Tennessee watershed, and then the rivers that flowed parallel from the Appalachians into the Gulf and to the Atlantic. That pattern of rivers was what directed the patterns of trade in the interior. And so physical geography has a lot to do with how things get started. But the pattern of rivers is one of the most important early ones. Of course, the Tidewater, Virginia colonies are the areas that the colonize or the plantations get started along the rivers that where the tide flushes out the river every day. So the Tidewater region is that really low-lying land, but it allows for ocean-going vessels to get, to come all the way up into the necks of the rivers. And so those were the contact points between these planters and England and the rest of the world. They could only afford to drive or to haul things so many miles to the Tidewater. And so that kind of held settlement in place until there was, of course, a self-perpetuating economy, which would only come about with the development of agriculture, other than plantation agriculture. And of course, you read about in Ralph Brown's chapter. You said you hadn't quite read that one yet, Evan.
What's that one about?
The chapter by Ralph Brown called Early Geography, Fact and Fancy. Did you get a chance to read that? It's about 6 pages.
I think I might have.
In this old book that we were talking about. Okay.
Yeah, I think I read it.
Do you remember anything surprise you about that? I mean, did you learn anything new from his perspective?
Yeah. To be honest, it's kind of all blended together. Okay. I'm trying to find the reading right now so I can reference it.
One of the things that Brown emphasizes in that first chapter of that textbook is that, well, in the title, it's fact versus fancy, right? In other words, fact versus beliefs, reality versus what people perceive. Okay. And what he says in that chapter is that what people believe is often much more significant than reality. Okay. So what Europeans perceived about the New World often directed what they attempted. Okay.
Yeah, I remember that. I just read it. I remember that now.
Because they didn't have the reality that we have. They didn't have the perspective that we have. So one of those early examples are the attempt by these English companies, the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth. These we have to also remember these are these are basically businesses that have been incorporated by the crown. They have been given a go by the government to go out and establish agriculture, to establish a money-making operation of some kind. That's, they have it's different than today, in the United States, where you think of the private sector versus the public sector. In those days, it was a combination of the private sector, but it was backed up by the crown. So they had special privileges. But these companies were their reason for existence was to establish what we'd call a staple crop, something that was making money and would make money for the crown. So they had they had the backing of the British crown to attempt it. So, but they didn't have any idea of the reality on the ground. Richard Hakluyt, who was a geographer, an English geographer at this time, suggested that they utilized latitude to assume what could be grown. Latitude was something that had already been developed, and it was longitude that would come about later. But latitude in Europe, the idea was that latitude pretty much was the control of climate. So the farther south you go, the warmer it gets, and the farther north you go, the colder it gets. And the extremes in the New World were, of course, much, much greater than in the Old World in Europe. But they believed that since Virginia had the same latitude as southern Spain and Italy, in the Mediterranean countries, that Virginia must be capable of producing the same crops that were produced in southern Spain and south of France and Italy, which were in demand in England. Things like citrus fruit, and even more so olive oil and wine, grapes. So they initially began to try to grow olive trees. They planted olive trees. They tried to plant vines for grapes. They had these ideas that they could produce these things. And of course, they were completely wrong, and those crops failed miserably, right? And before they can even get started, the Indians were killing them off too. So they had that to contend with. So the idea that, the ideas that people have are often much more important. And of course, you can go all the way back to Columbus with that one, right? Mm-hmm. Columbus was, Columbus never would have, and nobody would have in their right mind set off to try to get to Japan or Indonesia by sailing west if they realized the size of the planet was as big as it actually is, right? So we've got the circumference of, do you happen to remember in Geography 1114, do you happen to remember the actual circumference of the Earth at the equator?
Is it, I think it's near like 25,000, right?
You got it. It's 24,900 miles. Great guess. You remember that. 24,900 miles at the equator. But do you know what Columbus was going from? What he actually thought?
I don't know the number that he thought it was.
He was working from a theory of the size of the Earth based on the Ptolemaic estimation. Now, a Ptolemy was a leader, that's a title actually, of these Greeks in the ancient world. Well, there was a Ptolemy at a Ptolemy at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. All right, and Ptolemy had made it kind of a belief among learned people that the circumference of the Earth was about 9,000 miles, the equivalent of what we would call 9,000 miles today. And of course, they knew that Europe extended into Asia, and they realized after Marco Polo started, crossing to China and back, they realized the great distance between Europe and in the Far East in China, which was what, 5, 6, 7,000 miles. So they realized that the sort of the world island, those major land masses of Europe, Africa, and Asia were very long in terms of longitudinal distance. So that meant that there were only like maybe 2,000 miles across the ocean to get to Indonesia. But of course, it's far, far longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
So he never would have sought out, there never would have been this exploration in 1492, this expedition to get to the Far East, which discovered, of course, the New World, had it not been for that mistaken circumference of the Earth. And the real irony of all this, the real irony is that even before Ptolemy, there was a philosopher who in Alexandria, or in Egypt, a Greek scholar, who had correctly calculated the circumference of the Earth using the Pythagorean theorem, and there was an obelisk, a big tall obelisk at a place called Cyrene in Egypt, and he used Pythagoras's method to estimate the circumference of the Earth to 24,900 miles. Or about the time it was about 25,000 miles. But that was way too big. Nobody could accept that. Nobody could believe that. So the wrong idea got accepted. So anyway, and we'll see this idea that perception is more important than reality all the way into, well, perhaps even today, right?
Yeah.
Perception's what drives people's ideas. It's what tells them there's more risk or less risk. And it's really significant. It's very significant in terms of establishing groups. Some groups will fail, some groups won't. Another facet of Nostrand's book is this idea of cultural ecology, this ability for some groups to have kind of a cultural preparedness, I guess, for living in certain areas. And we'll see that the Spanish, for example, the Spanish colonized all over the southern United States, essentially from South Carolina all along the coast to Texas. And they never really spend much time, even though they have, the big fortress at St. Augustine, and they even tried to colonize Florida. The Spanish were never very successful in the humid parts of North America. Despite their success in the Caribbean, which is humid, but when it came to North America, you find them only really successful in the semi-arid and the arid parts, and in California. So the cultural core of the Spaniards, or the Spanish, becomes the Upper Rio Grande Valley, and then lesser so California. So environments that are similar to what they're used to in Spain and in the highlands of Mexico, which of course is dry. So those are some things. Well, did you say you had time that you had read Meinig's essay?
Yes, I did.
You did? What did you think of that?
I'm gonna hold up real quick.
Remember what he said about how he became a geographer?
Yeah, he had the maps, or the maps of the railways, I think, in Montana.
Mm-hmm. Washington State, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Eastern Washington.
East Washington, yep.
Yeah, he always he says he's always been a geographer, but he just began to realize it later,
Right.
And so he made maps as a kid, and he had these ideas about, he had a big imagination. And he lived on a farm and had, in railway, there were two railroads that crossed near his farm, and he would see these trains go by all the time, and he wonder where they're going, and so he was always very curious about places, and he if you read, I don't know how much you read, but eventually World War II comes along, and he gets his education at Georgetown, and then does his PhD up at Seattle at the University of Washington. And then he talks a little bit about his career, and he was able to, the first thing he did was to study his home country, the Palouse country of Eastern Washington, and try to understand how that region that he knew really well connected to the rest of the world, and how it developed over time, through, as agriculture developed, as settlers came in, and as agriculture developed, and agriculture changed. Okay. In his experience, the 20th century, the most important change came about during World War II for him. World War II was a huge watershed in how things changed. I don't know how far you got there, but
I read it all.
Okay, so you remember what he said about his dad? His dad was a farmer, small farmer, and how was he different from everybody else around him? Recall?
I don't recall. I read it last week. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Remember what he said about his horses?
No.
Well, he said that his dad, his dad was a son of an immigrant from Germany, right? He was the youngest child in his family of a group of people who came from Saxony. They came over into Iowa and then eventually migrated out to Washington.
Yes.
Basically, he was a first generation American, and but he had workhorses, and what Meinig said about his dad was that he loved those workhorses, and he didn't want to buy a tractor. He wanted to keep his horses, but of course that made him kind of a laggard. And workhorses could never keep up with tractors, and so their farm was pretty small and couldn't expand until later. But part of that change that comes about in places like the wheat country of Eastern Washington, this is where he grew up, is mechanization comes along. Mechanization diffuses into the area, and mechanization requires, or at least in our kind of economy, mechanization requires that farms expand, farms get larger. And of course, farms get larger by farmers buying up other farmers, buying out other farmers. And so the number of farms decreases, the size of farms increases, and farms themselves become far more efficient with mechanization. There are trade-offs. I mean, that sounds all good and everything, but at the same time, what happens? That the region becomes specialized. Agriculturally, it becomes very specialized, and things disappear. Workhorses disappear. They don't perhaps feed hogs for local consumption anymore. Local dairy production gets displaced. So not everybody produces their own milk anymore. So this is the sort of change that we're thinking about in this course, is that there are things that diffuse in, there are changes that come about, and that forces people to react. Sometimes they're reacting on their beliefs rather than the reality. Yeah, but they react either way, and they do things that create distinctive places and economies. And of course, ethnicity and religion, that shapes the landscape and shapes the flavor of places immensely. Remember what Meinig says about, like the second book that Meinig wrote was about wheat production in Australia, and he actually went to Australia and did a sort of a historical geography of wheat production, and sort of like his doctoral dissertation on the Palouse. And he said that he figured that, studying Australia would be real similar to studying, Western North America, and that he expected these great similarities to come about. But then he said it was one of the most important things he ever did, because he believed that those places would be very similar and the process would be very similar, but they happened to not be very similar at all, largely because of the homogeneity of the Australians and when they colonized their country agriculturally. And Americans, have this incredible diversity of ethnic heritage and, migration from all over Europe, and very different sets of beliefs and, approaches to natural resources. And to him, that was a really important learning experience. He said that he learned a lot more about North America by understanding Australia. So I thought that was really interesting. And he realizes that, when you step out, and have you ever traveled overseas outside the United States?
I've been to Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Where'd you travel there?
Just kind of travel around. I was in England, France, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands.
You went everywhere. That's great.
It was a circle.
Oh, what were some things that you remember about your travels? Was that like one trip?
Yeah, it was one trip.
Like
it was 17 days. Yeah, in the summer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you would have had enough culture shock from that. So when you got back to the United States, how'd you feel?
Sad. I wanted to be back there. Like the cuisine probably more than anything, but I just remember I'm from Kansas.
You missed the cuisine, you said?
Yes, more than anything.
All right.
But I'm from Kansas.
Was there anything that you found that, different that maybe you preferred back in the United States or in Kansas?
That I prefer the United States over Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like the fact that people can, or like, I guess the size of it,
yeah,
I enjoy. And you can drive through Kansas and Oklahoma in the same time. You could drive through 3 countries there, and there's a bunch of different cultures and languages and adaptations that you have to make to where you're at. Where here, it's pretty much all the same. Yeah. As far as like Kansas, Oklahoma goes.
Sure. Yeah.
It was mostly just oddities that in England or in Great Britain, they had to pay for each TV they had, like a reoccurring charge that I thought was very strange. And I guess it's strange, but made me feel grateful that we don't have to do that here. I think it was more policy things than the land.
Yeah. See, for me, it was like toilet paper.
Yes.
Those little stupid rolls like that. I couldn't wait to get back to the United States where we had big rolls of toilet paper.
Right.
Or showers where you could actually, turn around in.
Mm-hmm. And air conditioning too.
Air conditioning. Yeah. That's another one.
Ice in the drinks. The list goes on. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there are these trade-offs, right? But you learned a lot about your own culture when you're somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You think about things you take for granted. And what town in Kansas are you in?
I'm from Valley Center, which is north of Wichita by like 20 minutes. But
right. So you're like 2 hours north of me.
Yes. I just drove back. That's why I missed the last Zoom. I was driving back because my roommate had corona. So.
Oh, really?
Left.
So you're quarantined.
I'm quarantining. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.